Our economies are mainly linear. That means we take resources from nature, manufacture them into products, use those products, and then dispose them as waste. So the basic principle is a little bit like take, make, use, dispose. This is how we know it, and it seems to be quite normal to us. But linear economy is not a paradigm that can bring us through the 21st century. Resources are scarce, but population and economies are growing. And the insane amounts of waste pressure ecosystems and thereby threaten the foundations of prosperity and sometimes even of life itself. But what is the alternative? Many believe it's a concept called the circular economy. And the basic thought is actually quite simple. Instead of exploiting ever new resources, we use the ones which are already circulating in the economy. Repair, reuse, recycle, those are key words here. And in a way, this concept is much more in line with the planet we live on. I mean, look at nature. Wherever you look, you will find dynamics that are based on cycles, and nothing gets really wasted. When a tree grows out of the soil and then the leaves fall to the ground, they become soil again and provide nutrition for the next generation of plants. So life itself is circular. For a very long time, humans produced goods in quite a similar way. When they built a house out of wood, the house could rot afterwards, become soil again, and new plants would grow. Or when they used non-organic materials, like metal to produce a sword, when the sword was no longer used, they melted the metal to produce something different. The Industrial Revolution has changed this principle radically towards a linear economy. Now, 200 years later, the next change is about to happen. And it has to happen in a world with scarce resources and limited ecosystems. But even though the basic principle of circular economy is quite simple to understand and there are already a lot of concepts out there, we are far away from a transformation on a larger scale. Why? Why is that so? What are the challenges on the path towards a circular economy? And what is its potential for a more sustainable trajectory path? How can we reconcile ecology and economy? And what aspects of the concept of circular economy are just like a nice utopia and which ones are actually feasible concepts? These are questions I will discuss today with Jamie Butterworth. Jamie is founding partner of Circularity Capital, a specialist investment firm which supports, promotes, invests in businesses in the circular economy. Before that, he was a CEO of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, an influential platform for circular economy, which together with McKinsey also published a very influential report, which maybe we're going to talk about a little bit later. Let's see. Jamie is also a visiting fellow at the Oxford University's Smith School, and thus he brings together both sustainability knowledge and an understanding of business opportunities. I'm very excited to talk with him today. Jamie, thank you very much for taking the time today to discuss these very interesting and also like avant-garde topics with us. But I was wondering, like, how avant-garde is it actually? Like, we all know the term recycling. We all have a basic understanding what that is. And now circular economy is said to be something new, something innovative, but isn't it just like a new word for something old, or is there more to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things here. One is that the circular economy as a concept has existed for billions of years. So effectively, this whole idea is based on living systems and the idea that in living systems, waste no longer exists. And you have flows of nutrients that when you finished in one use cycle, they become food for the next. And the whole system ultimately can run on renewable energy. And that's ultimately what we're looking to achieve within a circular economy. I think this kind of bit around recycling is fascinating, and Just to give you one thought there, so if you take the mobile phone that you probably have in your hand or in your pocket, and you were to recycle that phone, you would capture less than 0.5% of its original value. So effectively what happens is it ends up in a big hopper, gets mixed up with lots of other IT stuff. It goes into some big shredding machine. This is best case scenario. And it gets mechanically shredded. And then some big magnets and other approaches pull out various precious metals. And you end up with a little bit of metal going back into the system. Whereas what if you could take that mobile phone after it had been used by one person and refurbish it and sell it to another person? And then you would capture probably half of its original value. And even better, what if you never sold it? What if you sold, communication as a service effectively, and then you started to optimize the design of the product to be cycled over many users? So recycling would be part of this, but a very small part of the bigger picture.
Now you were talking about maybe you could capture 50% of the original resources. So is circular economy basically more like an ideal that we can never reach, and no product will ever be 100% circular? It's always a matter of degree, or do I understand that correctly? Or can we actually move to 100% circular products?
Yeah, sure. Well, within living systems, we can absolutely move to a 100% circular system. That would be something like the way a rainforest is operating, for example. So it's using sunlight, it's using water, it's using nutrients, and it is then being able to generate almost constant diversity effectively within that. The argument within the circular economy is that we might still want things like syringes and X-ray machines and computers. So we're going to need some technical nutrients, if you like. So things like polymers, things like metals and alloys, etc. So the way that we look at those within a circular economy is design the products within which those nutrients sit or components to be disassembled, or to, first of all, to be maintained and kept operating at the highest possible quality for as long as they can be, even to be upgraded between use cycles. And ultimately, if they can't be kept going, they can then be decomponentized, the components used again, or the materials can be reused within another part of the economy.
Coming back to my original question, so there are some areas where you use mainly organic resources where you can come to 100%, but now you're describing other areas where maybe it can be 50 or 60, but never actually 100% truly circular, right?
Yeah, and the point there is that you will always have you'll always require some virgin resource input into that model in order to top up the system. But there's a huge amount out there already in the system which can be mined or harvested. But also when you are then bringing new materials into the system, you're using a fraction more than we do today. And you're also doing that using renewable energies to source and mine and bring those resources into the system.
Okay, and where do you see seeing all these things that you also still do need virgin resources, but there's a great potential to reduce this amount much more, which is already a lot and a very important way to go. But which are the areas, maybe industrial areas or in general economical areas, where you see a particularly high potential for a circular economy?
Yeah, there's a whole range of areas where there's a high potential. Ones that really stand out are some of the more used materials, like, for example, concrete and steel within the construction sector. So again, there's a huge overlap there to both resource use, but also, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, where those types of resources are very extractive in terms of how you mine in order to process them, and also very energy intensive industries. And those are an area where, for example, many buildings today are never designed to be deconstructed to optimally harvest and reuse the components within them. And even in the manufacturing process of those materials, they're hugely energy intensive. So there's a lot of opportunity, both financially for investors, but also in terms of innovation and more broadly in terms of the benefits to the environment to focus on those types of sectors.
Right now you said they are not designed to be reused, and I think that's a important keyword here maybe for us. So like circular economy has to be implemented in the design in the first place. Like it's not like you make something, you use it, and then afterwards you see how you can like reuse or recycle it. It's like something that is like in the whole process, like also in the design and making process, like you have to consider that. Help us to understand a little bit better, like how does that work, like the circular process?
Yeah, and maybe one kind of interesting example there, because everybody is so familiar with it and it's so obvious, is around packaging, for example. So one interesting analogy is to say, what would you do if you walked into your bathroom at home and your bath was overflowing with water? Would you get all the towels out and start mopping up the water, or would you actually go to the tap and turn the tap off? Well, of course, you would turn the tap off, right? And this is exactly the same as in the plastic packaging supply chain, where you've got so many different formats of packaging that are entering the society effectively. So you've got, you know, the crisp packet with maybe 5 to 7 layers of metal and plastic inside it, which nothing can be done to recycle that because it's, you know, too difficult to separate those different materials. And so one of the big focuses at the moment under an initiative called the New Plastics Economy Initiative is to actually get the packaging manufacturers and the brands and the recycling system to talk to each other. So then you start to say, actually, we're going to have an economy where we have 2 types of nutrients. We have these biological nutrients, which are designed, for example, compostable materials that might meet contact with food waste, and they can safely be composted within industrial composters or home composting. And then in the technical sense, we would start to actually work out which plastics we want to have, which plastics we want to phase out, and then we would also start to invest in the recycling infrastructure for those plastics which are inherently circular. So for example, Coca-Cola bottles typically are made out of plastic called PET, which has much higher recycling rates. It's a very pure material, is a mono material, it's not mixed with other materials, so that's relatively easy to cycle. Whereas some other materials, like for example polystyrene, is extremely difficult to recycle, very costly to recycle, very little technology out there to do that. So you're starting to really think about, when you design the product, how it is going to fit not only the use period to make it a delight to use as a user, but also right the way through to what happens in the next life cycle.
I mean, linear economy is so stable, kind of, you know, like one reason why we are not moving forward is because it's still very cheap to use new resources, no? And as far as I understand it, often it's cheaper to use new, like virgin resources instead of like the ones which are already circulating. So maybe I'm wrong, maybe you can comment on that, but also like what are the incentives for companies to change today to circular business models?
Yeah, absolutely. And to put that into context, we as an investor in this area believe that there are some areas that are investable today and some areas that will ultimately change, but there will need to be some external levers to make those investable today. And effectively what those levers are, you've got a few things working here. One is purely whether a corporate business moving towards a more circular business will actually make more money. So there are some types of businesses that typically this works for very well. So if you look at a company like Philips, the healthcare manufacturing business, they have started to move a large proportion of their business away from selling products like MRI machines or blood pressure monitoring machines to providing, for example, healthcare or imaging as a service. It then becomes in their interest to design an MRI machine, which is designed to come back to them, to be upgraded, to be disassembled, remanufactured, etc., and to use less energy, right? So that would be a kind of strategic reason for doing that, right? The second is we are also definitely seeing regulators starting to make it more difficult for companies to pollute, for example, plastics in packaging. So you've got a lot of companies starting to set these long-term targets around, it could be climate change, it could be use of recycled content, etc. So they're moving. You've also got a next generation of consumers who are increasingly asking questions about the provenance of products and where they're coming from.
I was just wondering a little question, because like in the field of mobility, for example, there's a lot of discussion about moving from mobility as a product to mobility as a service, you know, and there it's not so much about circular economy but more about the impact of digitalization, that business models change. Before was about selling a car, and of course it still is partially, but more and more it's about selling a mobility service, like Uber does it, for example, or when you have like a fleet of self-driving taxis and stuff like that, you know. So would you say, when we think about how does circular economy affect business models, or how does a circular business model look like, that this shift from selling products to selling service, this shift towards a service economy, is one factor, or is supported by that?
Yeah, so that's driven by another lever, which is relatively mature technology. So once you know the status, location, demand, condition, and availability of an asset, you suddenly open up a whole range of different business models, right? So the event of everybody owning a smartphone has allowed a lot more assets that were currently unused to be used. So that model that you mentioned around Uber has been enabled by the smartphone effectively, and that is still massively disrupting the economy at the moment. It started in B2B, it's coming into B2C now, and just that data is allowing greater utilization. It isn't necessarily leading to circularity in every example, but obviously if you combine the two, you then can potentially start to optimize and design that asset to also come back. Because the great thing about the product as a service model is that the operator becomes the owner of the asset, and it becomes in their interest to keep that asset operating for as long as possible, to predictively maintain it, and effectively to increase its asset life and utilization.
In the case of mobility, for example, like digitalization is a driving force. Digitalization is about information very much. It's information technologies. And this is the key technology here that drives it. And I was wondering, like in circular economy, you also need a lot of information. Like, for example, when you want to be a shoe part of a circular economy, or any product or a smartphone, you need to know what are the resources here, the ingredients kind of, you know, what has been used and how. Do you see a combination between like circular products and digitalization, in the sense that digitalization can be a facilitator?
Yeah, for sure. Like data is really key here. And interestingly enough, in the tighter loops, where you have a company that is maybe leasing the product and getting the product back, that's relatively easy to do, because they will have all the information about the materials, the components, how the product is assembled, how it's disassembled, how it's repaired, what software it has, etc. So if it's company to company or within their supply chain, that often already exists and can be really quite sophisticated today. The thing which is also beginning to happen is more of this data flow actually outside of a company to company loop. And that's, for example, in the materials in clothing or something. In order to be able to make sure that this shirt becomes another shirt at the end of its life or similar, we need to ensure that there is much more visibility and transparency around the materials that are being used, in order that that can be processed. And there's a whole range of different initiatives going on at the moment to create almost like a database of materials and components to be able to reuse those. The point you mentioned on, however, is really interesting, that there are obviously certain things that you could do that would increase data but increase complexity. So for example, putting a small chip into something could then create issues at the end of life in terms of recyclability. And there are other things going on here, like the miniaturization of certain products. So there are lots of really interesting data solutions. There are also quite a few challenges which companies are currently trying to overcome.
Like, again, one last question to the incentives. Like, what are reasons for companies today to participate in such a process, and maybe also to be more transparent about their products and so on?
I think the first driving factor, and this isn't for all opportunities, this is for a subset of opportunities where the economics really work. This is actually building businesses that are developing higher margin products or services, they get these stickier repeat customer interactions. For example, in a product as a service model where you're selling a service, so you don't sell something once and then the customer runs away. You're able to sell them that product again and again. You get better visibility and quality of earning. And ultimately, a lot of these companies are just becoming very valuable now. So you can see that people are starting to get more interested in these circular business models. So you've got a lot of companies doing it purely from the financial perspective. And then I think you've got two other factors. One is companies are doing it to stay ahead of the regulators to some extent. So you see things like the EU Circular Economy package come into place. You've got a lot of companies starting to respond to that. And also you've got a growing number of consumers who are increasingly interested in sustainability. So you're able to target those types of customers as well.
We already talked a little bit about different areas where circularity could be more or less important. Like we can't go into detail like completely, but you mentioned, for example, steel industry. But like there are not only different areas in industries, but also areas around the world in different parts of the globe where conditions are very, very different. And I mean, there are countries where even like this very basic form of recycling or disposing waste and stuff like that is a problem, you know, like even like these first steps today. So like maybe because our target group, like our audience here is a global audience, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the relevance in different parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a great opportunity for developing markets to be able to develop in a more circular way. So you imagine in a developed market in, for example, Europe, we have a lot of legacy infrastructure which is incredibly linear, right? So it's maybe a bit analogous with the shift towards mobile phones in developing markets, where rather than building all of the landline infrastructure, they've been able to leapfrog and go straight to cellular networks, for example. We believe that there's a lot of analogies with that for emerging markets where in fact they may be able to leapfrog today's linear economy and shift towards building a more circular economy from the start, which I think is really exciting. I think in developed countries, there's also a big opportunity to reorientate certain supply chains, certain infrastructure, and you can see there's a massive pull from corporates at the moment to actually identify circular economy solutions.
Like also in the study that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation published together with McKinsey, there's like a lot of talking about that this transformation towards a circular economy could stimulate economic activity, create jobs and stuff, you know, because like, and that's a question because you were saying that in markets in low-income countries of the global south that maybe they can leapfrog, you know, a certain step of linear economy. The question is always, why should they do it? I think like there's one obvious reason to me as I see it, because by not putting so much pressure on the environment, on ecosystems and so on, they basically secure the foundations for prosperity in the near and far future. But now from the economic perspective, if we look at it from the economic perspectives, where do you see the opportunities and the chances of a circular economy for like emerging markets or developing markets or also markets of the global north?
Yeah, I mean, let me give you a perspective on two fronts. So one is I can very directly answer your question as to where we see the opportunity from a financial perspective in Europe or developed markets, because we operate a fund that invests in companies in this space. And I'll share some thoughts on that. Secondly, I'll try and give a more systems perspective in terms of what the challenges are kind of more broadly. But yeah, so our activity by way of background is we are investing in European small, medium-sized businesses that are enabling the circular economy. We invest across Europe effectively and are looking for businesses that are accelerating the transition to the circular economy, often providing solutions that large corporate businesses need within their supply chains. And we think there that there's a huge opportunity for growth. A lot of the change is going to come from smaller, more nimble companies that are coming up with the types of new business models and technology solutions that are going to be required to make this transition. So it's very much our focus on supporting those companies to grow and to develop and to develop globally. So a lot of those companies will be based in Europe, but they will be operating globally. So just to give you one example, we have an investment in a business called Winnow Solutions, which focuses on reducing food waste in commercial catering facilities. So what it does is it uses an AI camera to identify every piece of food waste that goes into the bin in a big hotel or restaurant or cruise ship or similar. And it then allows the chef or the kitchen manager to have a very detailed inventory of everything that was being thrown away, what part of the process, how much that cost. And simply having that data is resulting in the redesign of the menu. And that's avoiding, on average, across 1,200 sites globally, 53% of waste from existing. So it's halving waste and doubling the profitability of these kind of sites. So we believe that those kind of solutions are increasingly going to be rolled out. And so capital will be required to grow those types of companies. And that provides an opportunity for investors. And we think that there's also a real demand in the market for, as investors would call it, kind of ESG opportunities, environmental, social governance type opportunities. And so these types of companies are likely to become more valuable in the future. From a broader perspective, there is a kind of elephant in the room here probably, which is that right now in our today's economic system, we don't price everything in. So we don't price in clean air, we don't price in carbon, we don't price in the cost of pollution, etc. So if, for example, I am buying a pair of jeans that were made somewhere in Southeast Asia and the dyeing process to create those jeans is incredibly polluting, the energy source is maybe coal powered, so there's a huge amount of degradation to the local ecosystem and it's shipped all the way to Europe. None of that is priced in. Those are kind of negative external environmental externalities, as an economist would call them. And until those are priced in, that means that not all of this is going to be investable, right? So we spend our time looking for that subset of opportunities where we can generate a positive environmental impact whilst creating a financial return. But in order to open up more of those opportunities, ultimately we will need to price in those externalities. And that's what regulators are beginning to try and do today.
I already asked the question, but I didn't quite understand yet how more jobs can be created and how this could actually contribute to economic prosperity, as you said. Because I mean, this is an important argument, also for political stakeholders to support such a transition. And maybe it was just me who didn't understand, but maybe like in 2-3 sentences, you can explain the logic behind it a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting pieces of work on this topic is through an organization called X-Tax in the Netherlands. And the way that they describe this is to say that in today's economy, typically what we do is we tax people, but we don't tax non-renewable resources, okay? And so actually what we would be trying to achieve within a circular economy is the opposite. We would actually want to start to make non-renewable resources more expensive and instead to reduce the tax on labor to end up with more people actually being creative and using the human resource input to be able to make products back into products effectively. So if you think in that model, what you would end up with is more remanufacturing, repair, refurbishment, upgrade type operations and less throughput of really cheap energy and resource inputs. What we would anticipate seeing, and various different people have modeled this for the UK economy, it's done by an organization called WRAP. Citra have looked at this, for example, for the Finnish economy, is there will be some winners and losers in this transition. For example, direct mining, primary extraction would reduce, but you would end up with more service jobs, more remanufacturing, refurbishment, repair, upgrade type jobs within the economy. The other thing you have to put into context as well is that it's not a static outlook, right? So we've got a situation in the world today where we have emerging market economy which wants to consume like we do in the West, okay? So they want to be able to go to supermarkets and buy stuff and have the same types of benefits that we have in an emerged market. So we're going to end up with a lot more middle-class consumers within the global economy. So we're going to end up with a general increase in demand as well for even virgin resources. So it's quite a complex picture, but the view is that you could end up with a very vibrant economy. You will have some winners, some losers in the transition, but ultimately it would be beneficial.
So when we think about what has to happen and who are important stakeholders here, you work in finance, you work in investment. Where do you see the role of the finance industry and investors like you, but also other investors in this transformation?
Okay, so I think this is a really exciting time actually for finance and the circular economy. So clearly we are going to need a lot of investment in order to be able to take advantage of this opportunity in moving towards a circular economy. We're also looking at the circular economy in parallel to another huge shift in the world finance system. And this is as an increasing number of investors are looking at the opportunity to create a financial return alongside a measurable positive non-financial impact, be that societal or environmental. So the whole topic of impact investing. So there's a huge wave of interest and capital looking at how they can actually capture that. And I think the circular economy provides a really powerful framework for being able to deliver those premium financial returns alongside the measurable non-financial impact. I think the other key thing to say here is that the way that markets work is they invest more when they see an opportunity to create more returns. So what we also need to do here is target that subset of opportunities where we can demonstrate there's an opportunity to create that attractive financial return. So we really do need to be investing in circular businesses that are growing, that will then lead to more capital being invested within this sector.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also like a very, as I understand, like a very, very, very slight shift towards a stronger long-term thinking, like from very big strategic investors. Like Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, he also wrote in a couple of letters to the CEOs, you know, and those are like very influential letters, that he's asking for more of this like, sustainable concepts, long-term thinking, and like moving away from this very short-term profit orientation. I mean, like, it's still a profit-oriented sector. How strong do you see that shift? Like, is there really, are capital flows actually moving away from like short-term profit maximization to more sustainable concepts? Or is it still all about profit maximization, but like then eventually it can be also sustainable?
Yeah, so I'll just give you one example. So again, we come back to the Netherlands, but in the Netherlands there is a pension fund called PGGM, which represents the healthcare workers of the Netherlands. And one day they decided to issue a sort of questionnaire to their members and said, what do you actually want from us as a healthcare provider? And they said, well, we want you to provide us with a pension income, but we don't want you to do that at the expense of society or the planet, right? What we want you to do is to deliver us a return, but we also want to see some positive, measurable, non-financial impact. And this is like a wave which is now hitting university endowments in the US, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, etc. More and more people are starting to ask this question. What I would say is investors want to have their cake and eat it. So they want to have a positive non-financial impact and they want to have strong returns. And that's where I think the circular economy is particularly interesting, to then find that subset of opportunities. But it's really helpful, I think, that the whole debate around the purpose of finance, what it's actually used for, what is fiduciary responsibility, what should it be doing, is happening at the same time that we're trying to build a different type of economy.
It sounds excellent to me, so let's talk a little bit about the problems and see all the sides. Not every process can be reversed, like you have natural resources, you take them out of from nature, you manufacture them into product, and sometimes it suggests the model that you can just turn this product into a natural resource again, kind of reverse it, come to, but like this doesn't really work, does it?
A lot of this is about design. So it's about actually designing the product up front to be able to be repaired and upgraded. So for example, the Japanese printer manufacturer Ricoh, since around the late 1980s, has had this Kaizen continual improvement process to get better and better at designing Ricoh photocopier or printers, which can come back to them and be disassembled and rebuilt. So they're fully optimized for that. So they now arrive back in the factory after their first life. They go through an automated remanufacture process, and they actually get upgraded, and they leave the factory in better condition with better processing, etc., than they started in the first place. So that's one thing, is obviously if you can optimize the design of the product, you enable that. There are obviously some challenges here though. So I mentioned miniaturization. For example, think of smartphones. They don't get much bigger. The PCBs and internals of them are getting smaller all the time. Think of earbuds, things like that. So a lot of companies are looking at different approaches there, and there it really is more about the recycling technology process. How much of those initial materials can you extract? How many life cycles can you get through before you need to get to the recycling point? Because some of the repair and remanufacturing is becoming more difficult because of that miniaturization, for example.
You showed us a little bit like the positive potential of a circular economy. By also referring to the term of growth, as you said, before. But I mean, isn't that also a limit, to the power of circular design or circular economy? Like whenever it's about, we still need virgin resources, and if that should then accelerate economic growth, then you will need more resources, so it kind of undermines its own logic, no? Because I mean, the whole point is that we move towards a transition path, that we move towards a scenario where we need less and less and less resources.
Yes, so this is a really interesting question, the question around growth. And obviously, unless you are able to design a system which ultimately reuses those resources and can use renewable energy in order to be able to remanufacture, refurbish, etc., then you're on a transition pathway, right? So the best analogy here is to look at, as I say, at living systems, where you have almost infinite diversity with a group with nutrients which are able to cycle, and they're able to be to extract their energy from renewable resources, for example. So this is exactly what is outlined in the book Cradle to Cradle by William Madonna and Michael Braungart, where they ask the question, look, if I design a product which is designed to be taken apart at the end of its life and to be repaired and reused, and in the process I use 100% renewable energy and I don't create any toxicity, then actually where's the problem, right? And that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to an economy where we can have growth to be able to satisfy a growing population of people who actually want to have access to IT, to healthcare, etc., by radically changing the way we design and sell products, and completely decouple the use of fossil fuels to manufacture those products, and ensure that there is much higher rate of cycling of those nutrients, be they biological or technical.
Okay, so you kind of see a potential there through circular economy for a green growth scenario, where there would be some form of economic growth activity and stuff, but decoupled from the increasing use of natural resources.
Exactly, and this is where actually you have a bit of a balance between efficiency and effectiveness. So one argument is to say, look, what we'll do is we'll just persuade everyone to use less, right? Use less, buy less, and then everything will be okay, yeah? And arguably that's pretty unrealistic, right? The other is to say that you could have total abundance in a circular economy. The kind of middle ground is that actually there's a huge amount of waste in the system that needs to be reduced. So like that food waste, do we halve the food waste? Just take that out of the equation. The next bit is then you design it to be circular, right? So there is a balance between efficiency and effectiveness. It isn't one or the other. We need to deliver both to have an optimal outcome.
You mentioned Netherlands before, and to these global differences between different regions and stuff. Netherlands is said to be a best practice example for circular economy. And I read that apparently around 30% of the resources being used already are from circular. But is that really the case? Is Netherlands like so much in the forefront, and can we learn something from it, or were there like very special conditions that only work for the Netherlands but we cannot transfer to other countries?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure about those exact statistic figures. What I can say is that the Netherlands is a geography where the concept of the circular economy is very widely understood by, someone in the street, basically. I think there's a few things that are related to that. One is actually a documentary about the particular topic of Cradle to Cradle was aired in the Netherlands about 15, 20 years ago, and a lot of people watched it, and that planted a seed. I think the next thing is that the Netherlands, obviously, a lot of it is very low-lying geography, which is very prone to sea level rise. So there's a kind of natural concern around climate change, which is quite immediate. And you have a population of people who are concerned about that. You also have very high population density in the Netherlands. So probably also starting to really think through how does a growing population of increasingly consumptive humans sit within the rest of the kind of geography and environment and the ecosystem in which they live. And also you've got a lot of universities, research centres, and you've had a lot of investment by the Dutch government and a lot of those regional areas to really push on education in this space. And actually we haven't really touched on education, but that's a really important component of this challenge.
You mentioned climate change. I mean, like some of the things you said, I think are also relevant for other countries. I mean, like the documentary thing is very interesting for me also, because it shows us also like the impact of art or public discourse, on political decision making and economic pathways, But like what you said, like this vulnerability to climate change is also something that is especially prevalent in the global south, where ecosystems are often more fragile and economies are not that resilient and stuff like that. So that can also be driving forces to kind of push towards circular concepts there. I do think that also in the Netherlands there was like a lot of political will actually. I think across all the ministries, like this concept was introduced. It was not like only part of of one ministry, of one specialized ministry for environment or something in that area, but was really implemented on a policy level. That I also found interesting to see that, of course, obviously it's a lot about the frame conditions, which are also set by regulatory frameworks. So when we talk about the positive potential and advantages, is it also that you become less dependent in a geopolitical sense from importing other resources? Because I mean, that seemed to be quite an obvious thought to me, but I have the feeling it's not mentioned as often in these economic debates as other factors. But I mean, you become more independent, no? I mean, that's a very important factor also for geopolitical reasons.
Absolutely, and it's an interesting kind of topic. One of the things that is very evident, which is that as humans, we are very good at getting better and better at extracting resources in a more effective and cheaper way. So we've obviously had all the discussions in the past about peak oil, peak resources in different forms, and whether we will ultimately run out of these types of resources. But way before these types of events happen, we typically become even better at finding the next lot of resource and extracting that in a cost-competitive way. So it can be a factor if, for example, you're in a geography where you don't have access to primary resources. So Europe would be a good example, not an enormous access to primary resources. So the ability to keep more of that valuable material cycling longer in your economy can be useful. But in our view, there are other drivers for circularity that are kind of more compelling. And that top one around, actually, in many instances, these circular business models just make more money than the linear counterparts. So you can become more competitive, and that's really attractive to companies.
One of the most pressing challenges that we are confronted with is climate change. And now we're talking about circular economy, a lot about the potential of not extracting as many resources as we did in the past, you know, and thereby also contributing to nature conservation and so on. Where's the link to climate change here?
Yeah, so the link to climate change is that around 40% of climate emissions don't come through energy that we use for heating, cooling, etc. They come through stuff that we buy, right? So actually, unless we can deal with our production and consumption model, we will never really solve the climate issue. We need to change the relationship that we have with all of those Amazon parcels that arrive through the post, for example, and how they ultimately are made, manufactured, shipped, sent, used, etc. A recent study by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, together with Material Economics, a Scandinavian-based research consultancy, looks at European climate emissions and estimates that towards 2050, greenhouse gas emissions in Europe could be reduced by 40% through circular business models. And that's looking at a number of these key material inputs like concrete and steel and others. So yeah, you can't really solve the climate issue until you also solve our relationship with stuff.
You do invest in small and medium-sized companies which are active in this field. Do you have a little bit an overview? Do you know how German companies are, if they're like ahead or like a little bit behind, or like where do you see them like in global competition? Is there a lot of activity going on in Germany in this area?
I think there are some fantastic German companies operating in the circular economy today. I think there's a really vibrant ecosystem of both kind of academic institutions, but also a very vibrant startup culture. And there's a lot of more sort of growth stage companies that are also doing very well in this space and expanding outside of Germany to really change the landscape more broadly. And if I give you one example of that, there is a business which originated in Berlin called Grover, which has established itself to provide a flexible rental model for a technology product. So the camera that is being used in this interview, for example, rather than owning that camera could be rented. The same for this iPad, the same for a computer screen, a piece of gaming equipment, a laptop used by a student, etc. And what Grover have done is to create a product as a service model for those technology products. So I use the laptop for as long as I need it for. Once I finished, it goes back to Grover. It gets refurbished into as new condition, and then it goes out to another customer. So what Grover are able to do is they're able to cycle these products over more customers, so they're able to satisfy the same number of customers using less products. They're also able to extend the life of those assets by refurbish them in between each use cycle. I always ask the question, how many of us have a drawer at home with some old IT equipment in it? I think most people do, right? And Grover's model is really interesting, and it is actually changing the way that things are done all the way across Europe. So they've now expanded out of Germany into Austria, the Netherlands, Switzerland, now Spain. And they're also now working in partnership with some really exciting OEMs who are looking, these are bigger brands or equipment manufacturers who are looking to actually sell their products as a service. So Grover's now providing the platform for them to do that. So for example, they have partnerships with people like Samsung and with Microsoft to help them sell their products as a service. So that would be a really good example of a German company that's really disrupting the linear economy, I would say.
It sounds exciting. It also like showed me again like the like here the concept of sharing economy and circular economy, they overlap a little bit. No, it's like a mixed concept, like it combines elements of both trends. Is that like also like, is that only in this example, or do you think that's like a general thing that like business, like circular business models often have elements of like sharing economy in them?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of overlap in different areas. The one thing I would say is not all sharing business models are circular.
No.
So what we're looking here for is the overlap effectively. I mean, you can also see a huge increase right now in, for example, resale companies. And again, not all of those would have a positive environmental impact, but there's a subset of those which are really interesting. So you're seeing a lot of growth in these types of businesses, to your point earlier, partly driven by technology and information, and some of those are really helping to enable the circular economy.
The German chambers of commerce and industry abroad, the AHKs, they sit all around the globe. There are more than 100 different out there, and they're actually quite important stakeholders in or agents in bringing together different stakeholders, bringing them on at the same table and stuff like that, and supporting companies to in their market entry. What do you think, what kind of people should be sitting there at one table, when it's about discussing the first steps towards a circular economy?
Yeah, well, I'll just give a little anecdote from something I was involved in a few years ago, which to me helps to explain why I think the circular economy is so exciting as a way of thinking. But I was part of the team who set up something called the Ellen MacArthur Foundation I mentioned before, which is a great organization which is a thought leader in this space and does a lot of work both producing reports about quantifying the opportunity of the circular economy, also works helping bringing to businesses together, and also does a lot of work in education. And one of the projects we had done in education was working with students who were studying design and technology, and they were coming up to their end-of-year course exam, and they could design anything they wanted to. So it was an open design challenge. The idea was they were to use what they learned about how to design to inform the design of a product. And this particular student had said to their teacher, before I learned about the circular economy, there was kind of nothing I could think of designing. It had been done before, a table, a chair, a car, whatever. After I'd learned about the circular economy, now everything I see, I want to redesign. And I think it's a framework for rethinking the design of products and services and materials and the way you make things and sell things. So really the audience is pretty broad, right? I think anybody who is interested in design, anyone who's interested in business, engineering, anyone who's running a company, this is something which is going to give them a new toolkit, a new way of thinking, which they can actually apply to what it is that they're doing.
That sounds like a very promising route, and developing new perspectives is obviously something that I as a philosopher personally like a lot. And to me it did really broaden my perspective today, that talk. So, thank you so much for taking the time, and there was so many aspects in it for me I have to think about. Well, it was really valuable for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to your members. A real privilege for me.
Circular economy. The basic concept sounds quite simple, but then in practice, in real life, the implementation on a larger scale sometimes can be very difficult. And what I took away from this conversation is that one reason for this difficulty to implement it on a larger scale is that you need to bring together so many different stakeholders. We need designers and engineers, researchers from academic contexts, but also business people who see the opportunities in these new business models and economic markets and areas. We need political stakeholders who are ready and have the courage to implement new political frameworks. And I think this is also a point where the German chambers for commerce and industry abroad are so vital and are so important, because they are the ones who can bring together different stakeholders for such a transition. So yeah, if you want to learn more about it, there's the online training course on circular economy, and I'm looking forward to the other interviews.